The village no one returns to. Phuong Tram used to think the pain of a betrayed woman would have a very distinct shape. A few nights of crying until her eyes swelled, a few meals choked down, a few times turning the phone on and then off, a few unanswered texts, a few wedding-related items shoved into the back of a closet. And then, driven by the cold survival instinct of everyday life, one would still have to stand up, brush their teeth, wash their face, change clothes, go to work, answer emails, sign contracts, smile at colleagues, eat dinner with their mother, and keep on living as if the heart had merely cracked, not been picked up, crushed, and shoved back into the chest by hands stained with lies. But after discovering that the man she was about to marry had another woman in a distant province, along with a little girl he tried to hide like a stain under the rug, Tram finally understood that some shocks do not make you scream right away. They lie dormant. They seep in. They crawl into the tiniest habits and render everything familiar entirely alien. They resided in the wedding dress still hanging in a frosted plastic garment bag in the corner of her wardrobe, in the sample invitation still saved on her phone, in her mother's impossibly gentle request, "Have a little more soup, dear," in the pitying eyes of friends who thought they were hiding it so well, in the phone screen light up at midnight with his number, going dark and lighting up again, as persistent as an eye that refused to close. Tram didn't answer, not because she was strong, but because she knew if she heard his voice one more time, she would have to listen to him twist everything into a narrative that favored. He had done it brilliantly the last time they met. He sat before her, shoulders slightly slumped, his voice hoarse, his eyes reddening at just the right moments, looking like a pitiful man haunted by his past rather than someone who had intentionally buried that past alive to walk into her life with a clean face. He said the other woman was history. He said they were never legally married. He said the child was an accident. He said he no longer had any feelings for her. He said he hid it because he was terrified of losing Tram. He said so much that eventually Tram stopped hearing the individual words and only saw a man desperately trying to protect the illusion of his own decency. What hurt her the most wasn't that he had lived another life. What chilled her to the bone was that throughout his entire explanation, he felt no genuine remorse for the woman who had birthed his child, nor did he think of that little girl as an innocent human being. They were simply obstacles he wanted Tram to overlook, so he could continue playing the groom in a pristine white suit. In that very moment, she knew that if she stayed, she would spend her entire life beside someone capable of turning his own cruelty into a sympathetic circumstance. And that was far more terrifying than betrayal. In the nights that followed, Tram's bedroom became a place where she could no longer breathe. Before, it had been her sanctuary after long days. Her desk by the window, a small bookshelf, a potted plant on the sill, a warm yellow nightlight, the cream-colored curtains her mother had sewn years ago. But after everything shattered, the room seemed to shrink, inch by inch. The walls felt as if they crept closer every night, the ceiling lowered, the air thinned out, and every single object became a witness. The chair where she used to sit, video calling him. The mirror where she had tried on bridal hairstyles. The drawer still holding a scrap of paper where he had written, "Just wait for me a little longer." The wardrobe hiding the white dress she lacked the courage to return. Whenever she lay down, she heard the hum of the air conditioner like an insect trapped in the wall, the ticking of the clock like water dripping into an empty basin, the screech of late-night motorcycles fading down the street, her mother tossing in the next room, her mother's soft cough, and then silence. It was the silence following that cough that hurt Tram the most. Her mother didn't blame her, didn't pressure her, didn't tell her to go back to him. But ever since the wedding was called off, her mother's eyes carried an ancient sorrow. The sorrow of a woman who had walked through most of her life and knew her daughter was now facing a long, empty, freezing road with no one to hold her hand. At every meal, her mother would place food in her bowl, talking about the price of vegetables, blood pressure medication, her younger sister's upcoming exams, the neighbors renovating their house, but wedged between all those words was an unspoken question. How will you survive this? Tram would take a few bites and feel the rice swell in her throat. Some days she would stand up, go to the bathroom, and turn the faucet on full blast so her mother wouldn't hear her dry heave. Some days she sat in her room until 3 in the morning, opening the window to let the wind in, but the city wind only brought the smell of exhaust, the scent of hot concrete cooling down, the stench of damp garbage from the alley, the greasy odor of frying oil from late-night food stalls, and the deeper she breathed, the heavier her C8 last became. She didn't want to die. She had never truly wanted to die. But there were nights she finally understood why a living person might just want to disappear. Not to die, just to disappear from her own name, from her own room, from the pitying stares, from the advice, from the role of the daughter who had to be strong, the older sister who had to earn money, the woman who had to explain why she couldn't bring herself to accept a man's past. On the fifth sleepless night, when the city had finally settled, she heard a cat crying down in the alley. A long, raspy, ragged wail, like a child crying through a parched throat. Tram was sitting on the floor, her back against the bed, hugging her knees, and suddenly goosebumps erupted across her back. Cat cried one more time, drawn out and desolate, then fell dead silent. The silence that followed was unnatural. It thickened rapidly, as if someone had just slammed a massive bowl over the entire alleyway. Tram stood up, walked into the bathroom, and flipped on the light. Under the harsh white glare, her face in the mirror was ghostly pale, eyes bruised with dark circles, lips cracked, hair tied back in a messy knot. She reached up and touched her neck, feeling as if an invisible rope were tightening there. It was in that exact moment that the thought of running away ceased to be just a thought. It became a pure survival reflex. She needed to leave the city. She needed a place where no one knew she had almost been a bride, where no one knew he had deceived her, where no one would look at her like she was a returned piece of merchandise, where no one would ask her why she couldn't just let it go, why she couldn't be more open-minded, why she couldn't be more practical. She needed a place incredibly far, incredibly cold, incredibly empty, where her pain would no longer be illuminated by the city lights. The following afternoon, after signing a massive translation contract, Tram walked down the sidewalk feeling absolutely no joy. The contract was highly lucrative, enough to take care of her mother and sister for months, but the happiness couldn't penetrate her skin. The traffic kept flowing. Horns kept honking. People were still buying iced herbal tea, eating banh mi, laughing, talking, arguing, talking on their phones, living their lives with a brutal sense of normalcy. Tram walked like a soulless ghost, nearly crashing straight into the herbal tea cart. The vendor frowned at her. "What's wrong with you, walking around like you don't have eyes?" Tram clumsily apologized, bowing her head and hurrying toward the parking lot. But the phrase haunted her. Without eyes. It was true, she had lived like someone without eyes. She hadn't seen the man lying to her. She hadn't seen her mother withering away day by day. She hadn't seen her own room turning into a sealed box. Sitting in her car, hands resting on the steering wheel, she watched the crowd through the windshield and heard a perfectly clear voice in her head. Go while you still can." That evening she went home, picked at her dinner, and told her mother the new contract required absolute quiet, so she wanted to go up to Dalat for a few weeks. Her mother looked at her for a long time. She didn't ask many questions. She simply said, "Go if you must, but remember to call home." The words were spoken so softly, but Tram had to lower her head to hide her tears. That night she packed her luggage: laptop, documents, dictionaries, coats, woolen scarves, cold medicine, a flashlight, power banks, a few books, and some cash. 2 suitcases slowly filled up. At first, she thought of the ocean, but the ocean had too many people trying to heal. She needed a place that wouldn't try to comfort her with blue skies and sunshine. She needed mist, pine trees, biting cold, damp earth, and paths with very few footprints. She chose Dalat. But Dalat in those first few days wasn't far enough. The hotel room 308 was clean, white sheets, hot water, stable Wi-Fi, a window looking out at a few pine trees and gray tin roofs, but the roar of tour buses on the street, the clatter of suitcases being dragged down the hallway, the sound of children laughing, the smell of roasted coffee and floor cleaner made her feel like she was still lying inside a box, just one painted a different color. For the first 2 days she tried to work, but every time her laptop screen went dark, his face materialized in the black reflection. By the 3rd day, she started renting cars to drive deeper into the outskirts, and then even further. Nowhere felt right. Some places were beautiful, but crowded with homestays. Some were quiet, but the locals were too nosy. Some hosts asked too many questions. Some places were so accessible, she knew that if she stayed there, a single tearful phone call from her mother would send her rushing right back. She wanted to be so far away that turning back wouldn't be easy. She wanted isolation not just as a state of mind, but as a geography. On the afternoon of the third day, as the early evening mist began to descend, she saw a small dirt path winding deep into the pine forest. The local motorcycle taxi driver she had hired shook his head and warned, "There's nothing in there, miss. The road is terrible. It goes too deep. If it rains, you're stuck. People rarely go in." Strangely, the phrase, "there's nothing in there," only fueled her desire to enter. Perhaps because right then, she felt there was absolutely nothing left inside her worth saving either. She left her large luggage at the hotel, carrying only a small duffel, a flashlight, and a coat, and walked down that dirt path by herself. The deeper she went, the taller and darker the pine forest became. The straight, pitch-black trunks rose on either side, like the pillars of an abandoned, forgotten church. The wind sweeping through the pine canopy created a prolonged, whistling hum, sometimes sounding like a heavy exhale, sometimes like someone whispering in a distant, ancient language. From the waterlogged hollows by the road, frogs began to croak even though it wasn't fully dark yet. At first, the sound was scattered, but then it thickened into layers. Damp, guttural, clinging close to the earth, as if beneath the rotting leaves, hundreds of tiny throats were expanding and collapsing to chant a sutra for the lost. Occasionally, a crow would caw from high above, raspy and broken, falling into the forest like a piece of black coal. Sometimes Tram stopped, thinking she heard footsteps directly behind her, but when she turned her head, there was only the mist and the motionless pine. Just as she was on the verge of giving up, a hazy patch of light appeared ahead. Deep in the forest, a small village sat low in a valley, barely a dozen roofs scattered among vegetable patches, flower beds, faded wooden fences, and narrow dirt paths. There was no electricity. Oil lamps flickered weakly behind window frames, their pale yellow light trembling in the fog. There were no dogs barking, no sound of children playing. There was only the chorus of frogs from the puddles surrounding the village, the wind funneling through the pines, and a scrawny black cat that darted across the dirt path, stopped, stared at her with piercing blue eyes, let out a long, thin, blood-curdling yowl, and vanished into a flower bush as if it had never been there at all. The first house Tram approached belonged to an old woman with silver hair tied in a low bun, frail, yet with a perfectly straight back, her eyes deep-set and brilliantly clear. In her front yard was a meticulously tended flower garden, white chrysanthemums, wild roses, pale blue hydrangeas, and several nameless forest flowers, interspersed with small wooden statues carved into the shapes of human faces, birds, cats, praying hands, and women with their eyes closed. The statues were beautiful, but so profoundly sorrowful that anyone looking at them would feel their heart sink. The old woman chuckled when she heard Tram ask if there was a house for rent. "There's no one coming here to rent houses, so how could there be houses for rent, child? You're a strange one. So many convenient places to stay, yet you seek out this place with no electricity, no roads, no mark. Why do you want to stay here?" Tram told her she needed a completely silent place to work. The old woman looked at her for a long time, a gaze that seemed to pierce through her face, her coat, her bag, and gazed directly into the dark circles under her eyes and all those sleepless nights. Then she smiled gently. "You're very strange, but I like you. If you don't mind it, stay with me. The attic is empty. I've lived alone for so long, it gets lonely." Those words landed directly on the softest, most broken part of Tram. After days of feeling like a wounded animal forced to pretend she was fine, a total stranger had just told her that her presence could make them feel less sad. She didn't know yet that the most dangerous doors often open with gentleness. The old woman's attic was spacious, divided into a bedroom and a small reading room. The windows looked down over the flower garden and further out, the pine forest. The old wooden staircase was immaculately clean, its handrails carved with intricate, swirling patterns. In the reading room sat a desk, a bookshelf, a few unfinished wooden statues, carving knives, sandpaper, and blocks of raw wood. Tram guessed the woman used to be a sculptor. The old woman laughed, saying she used to carve just for fun, that it wasn't worth anything. But looking at the exquisite lines of the wooden statues, Tram knew she was just being humble. Someone without immense talent could not carve such profound grief into wooden eyes. When Tram offered to pay rent, the old woman almost seemed offended. "What money, child? I invited you to stay for the company. We don't calculate things here the way they do out there." Then she said she would call her 2 grandsons to help Tram fetch her luggage from the hotel. She walked briskly down the dirt path, her frail silhouette fading into the mist, stepping as lightly as someone who did not let their full weight rest upon the earth. 2 young men who arrived shortly after were named Tyne and Duck, around 19 or 20 years old, with deathly pale skin, slender frames, gentle eyes, and shy smile. They greeted Tram politely. Tram told them to just call her sister. They looked at each other, smiled, and answered in unison, "Yes, sister." As they walked across the wooden floor, they made almost no sound. Tyne led her to a small horse-drawn carriage behind the house. The horse pulling it was so emaciated its ribs jutted out sharply. Its coat was ashen gray, its eyes clouded over, its mane sparse. It looked as though a strong gust of wind could knock it over. Tram anxiously asked if it could even walk. Duck stroked the horse's neck and smiled. "Don't judge by how it looks, sis. It knows the way better than we do." The horse turned its head and looked at Tram. In those clouded eyes lay an impossibly ancient exhaustion, as if it had dragged far too many people in and out of this forest. The road to the edge of the woods was steep and muddy, but the carriage glided with an eerie smoothness. The horse's hooves struck the ground with a dry, rhythmic clatter, sometimes echoing as hollowly as knuckles knocking against an empty coffin. The forest grew dark rapidly. Frogs croaked from the puddles, their voices growing thicker and thicker, sounding like the earth itself was breathing. A crow perched on a dead pine branch, tilted its head to look at them, and let out 3 raspy caws. A feral cat bounded across the trail, its eyes burning bright green, screeching like a crying infant before vanishing. Tram shivered. Tyne asked if she was cold. She smiled, saying just a little. She looked at the 2 boys, wearing only thin shirts yet entirely unshivering, their pale hands resting on the icy rim of the carriage looking as cold as porcelain, and for the very first time, a sliver of doubt traced its way into her heart. At the edge of the forest, they left the carriage and caught a ride back to her hotel. The taxi could only take 1 person, so Tyne and Duck told Tram to go ahead, saying they knew a shortcut and would follow right behind. But when Tram arrived at the hotel and rushed up to room 308, she found the 2 boys already standing there, waiting by her door. They smiled, saying locals always moved faster through the wood. The receptionist stared at Tram, talking to them with a deeply disturbed look in her eye. When Tram pointed to the boys and said someone was already helping her with her luggage, the receptionist looked around the empty hallway, opened her mouth as if to say something, but ultimately stayed silent. On the taxi ride back to the forest edge, the driver kept glancing at Tram through his rearview mirror. Every time she turned to talk to Tyne and Duck, he would shoot a bewildered look at the 2 empty seats beside her. When she got out of the car, he only charged her for 1 passenger. Tram asked, 3 of us and it's only this much. He looked at her, then stared at the empty space behind her, shaking his head with a sad, bitter smile. Poor thing. Before she could ask what he meant, he floored the gas and sped off. Tyne and Duck simply stood there, smiling gently. The fog rolled in. The forest was pitch black. The carriage was waiting. The skeletal horse stood completely paralyzed, its clouded eyes unblinking. As they neared the village, Duck noticed Tram shivering and told Tyne to make the horse go fast. The horse suddenly surged forward, tearing through the darkness so fast the trees blurred together. Yet the carriage didn't jolt or sway. It felt as if they were gliding over a layer of freezing air. The sound of hooves blending with the frogs around the village, the distant caws of crows, and the long wails of cats from the dark rooftops created a welcoming symphony that was both terrifying and utterly mesmerizing. The old woman was waiting by the charcoal stove. She pulled Tram inside, scolding her for not dressing warmly enough. When Tram took her hand, she flinched. The old woman's hands were freezing, not the mild chill of the elderly with poor circulation, but as biting cold as stones at the bottom of a winter stream. She laughed, saying the body just gets cold when it gets old. Their first meal was simple but delicious. Hot rice, wild vegetables, fragrant herb soup, and a deeply savory, dark braised dish. After the meal, she and Tram sat talking by the glow of the oil lamp. The old woman shared that she had no family left and had lived here alone for many years. Tram talked about her work, her mother, her sister, but carefully avoided digging too deep into her love life. Late that night, after going up to the attic, she opened the window and looked out. The night in this village was nothing like the night in the city. It was dense and it had a scent. The smell of damp earth, cold flowers, dying kitchen smoke, pine needles, and something slightly sweet, like fruit left to rot for far too long. From the distance, frogs thrummed continuously by the stream. A feral cat cried in the yard, its wail thin and drawn out, like someone dragging their fingernail down a violin string. Tram was about to close the window when she caught a fleeting glimpse of a white silhouette down in the garden. She lined out. The shadow vanished behind a flower bush. She told herself it was just the mist, but as she lay down, the sound of poetry began to drift through the air. A woman's voice, steeped in an unfathomable sorrow. I wander through the realm of mist, a drifting soul unable to forget earthly love. Oh no. The voice seemed to come from the yard one second, from the forest the next, and then hovered right beside her window. The poem spoke of a dead soul who still loved, still missed, still grieved for her human life, still viscerally understood that no matter how agonizing life gets, being human is always better than being a ghost. Tram lay perfectly still under the blanket, eyes wide open, as tears began to stream down her face without warning. During the first few days, the village treated her with a gentleness that made it dangerously easy to drop her guard. During the day, Tram worked in the attic. The old woman cooked rice, brewed tea, and brought up plates of wild fruit, bowls of hot soup, and constant reminders to wear a warm coat. In the afternoons, Tram strolled around the village. People here were docile, polite, and spoke very little. The more she observed, the more anomalies she found. There was not a single intact family. They were mostly women, young, middle-aged, elderly, and every single one of them carried a sorrow that had pooled deep in their eyes. Children were scarce and unnervingly quiet. Tyne, Duck, and a few other young men would appear out of nowhere and then vanish, as weightless as shadows. No one used money. They traded vegetables for firewood, flowers for medicine, fruit for fabric. No one wore warm clothes, despite the biting cold. Everyone's skin felt freezing to the touch. No house ever produced the sound of true, wholehearted laughter. Every evening, as the mist crept down from the forest, the frogs by the stream would strike up like a rhythmic wooden block. Feral cats would begin to wail from beneath the eaves, and crows returning from the forest would perch on the dead pine branches at the edge of the village, cawing out raspy notes like they were calling the roll for the dead. At first, Tram found it bizarre, but she wasn't afraid. She desperately needed somewhere different, and this place was so vastly different it made the life she left behind feel centuries away. No one asked her why she was sad. No one told her to forgive. No one told her to be strong. Here, pain was not treated as something broken that needed fixing. It was the common language, and that was precisely what began to soften her, like an exhausted traveler collapsing in the shade, completely unaware that the shade was cast by a highly poisonous tree. On a bright moonlit night, Tram couldn't sleep. The moonlight washed the village in a cold, silvery glow, blanketing the roofs, the vegetable patches, the flower beds, the dirt paths, and the wooden statues in the old woman's yard. She put on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her neck, and sneaked outside. The frogs by the stream sounded incredibly strange that night. Not scattered like usual, but surging in unison, dipping low and then rising high, like an invisible crowd chanting prayers in the mud. As she walked toward the stream, the poetry recitation drifted back into the air. The same poem, much closer. Tram stopped, her heart hammering. A girl's soft voice called out playing so late at night, sister. She turned around and saw Deem standing right beside her, a appearing out of nowhere. Deem was in her early 20s, her skin flawless white, her face stunningly beautiful yet tragic, her eyes perpetually brimming with tears. Normally, she barely spoke, just offering Tram a polite greeting before walking away. Tonight, she sat next to Tram by the water. When Tram asked if she was the one reciting the poem, Deem only offered a shy smile. Tram mentioned she loved this place, and that perhaps she would come back to live here longer in the future. Deem instantly panicked, grabbing her hand. Deem's hand was as cold as the midnight stream. "No, please don't. I'm begging you. Don't come here to stay." Tram asked her why. Deem stared down at the black water, reflecting the moon. "Only those carrying pain can find the way here. But once you choose to stay, it's incredibly hard to go back." Tram forced a laugh, asking if the village had strict rules. Deem shook her head. "No one locks the doors. But there are doors that, when you walk through them in sheer despair, you will never find your way back out." A feral cat screeched from the reeds, a long, torn wail, exactly like an abandoned child left out in the freezing cold. Deem stood up very quickly. "You need to go back. If she knows you came out here, she'll be upset." Then she recited the final line of the poem, her voice choked with tears. "Only now do I know that though life is full of suffering, being human is still better than being a ghost." Before Tram could ask another question, Deem stepped into a mist-choked path and vanished like a shard of moonlight dropping into the water. That night, Tram did not sleep. Near midnight, the poetry resumed, no longer just one voice, but the voices of multiple women bleeding together, mournful and monotonous. She crept to the window and peeked down. In the middle of the artichoke garden, bathed in pale moonlight, the entire village was gathered. The old woman sat on a high chair in the center. Surrounding her were women dressed in thin white shirts, holding hands, their hair falling loose, their shoulders trembling. Tyne Duck and a few children stood on the outer ring, heads bowed. Every single one of them was crying. The poem echoed into the night like a funeral without a coffin. The frogs down by the stream abruptly fell dead silent. A crow perched atop a high pine cawed exactly 3 times, then stopped. The black cat slinked past the garden, its green eyes flashing, before melting into the darkness. Tram stumbled backward, her scalp prickling with sheer terror. She went downstairs, needing to see if the old woman was truly out in the garden. But downstairs, the old woman was lying in her bed by the kitchen, sleeping peacefully, her breathing steady. Tram stood frozen at the foot of the stairs, the blood turning to ice in her veins. If the old woman was sleeping right here, who was sitting on the chair in the middle of the garden, if she wasn't dreaming, then how many shadows did each person in this village possess? The next morning she asked her. The old woman, currently lighting the stove, froze her hands. Her smile vanished entirely. "This village has its own rule. You're just a temporary guest. You shouldn't pry. Knowing too much is never good. Just pretend nothing happened last night." Her voice wasn't loud, but it was absolutely freezing. From that day on, the gentleness inside the house no longer offered Tram any peace. It only made her think of a soft cloth draped over someone's mouth right before they were suffocated. On a mildly rainy afternoon, the old woman went to the next house to trade tobacco for vegetables, leaving Tram home alone. She tried to work but couldn't focus. Out in the yard, the black cat that usually only prowled at night was suddenly sitting at the bottom of the steps, staring up at the attic. It didn't yowl loudly. It only let out a small, raspy croak, as if calling her. Then it turned its head to look toward the staircase. Tram stood in her doorway, deeply conflicted. She remembered the old woman telling her never to touch the locked wooden cabinet in the reading room. But today, when she walked in, the cabinet door was slightly ajar. Whether it was the wind, whether the old woman had forgotten, or whether something desperately wanted her to look, she didn't know. She stood before the cabinet for a long time, listening to her own heartbeat. Then she pulled the door open. Inside were rows of perfectly arranged small wooden boxes, each carved with a name. "My hand, lie, dime." Some boxes were so old the carvings had worn smooth. Some were newer, the letters still sharp. Tram's hands trembled as she pulled out the box bearing Deem's name. Inside lay a long lock of hair bound with white thread, a scrap of shirt fabric, a broken plastic bracelet, and a piece of paper with the poem she kept hearing, written in trembling handwriting, the ink blurred as if it had been soaked in tears. She opened another box. Inside was a photo of a middle-aged woman wearing an owl dye, the face of the man standing next to her viciously torn out. Another box held a bent ring, scraps of old letters, a pinch of dry earth. Yet another held a child's embroidered handkerchief, a few wisps of baby hair, a faded photograph. The more she opened, the tighter her throat seethed. These were not souvenirs. These were the remains of people who had been kept here by their pain. In the bottom drawer lay a fabric-bound notebook. The first page was written in the old woman's exquisite, sharp handwriting. Those who come to the village must be remembered by their exact pain. The following pages recorded names, ages, where they came from, and their unfinished tragedies. Abandoned by a husband, betrayed by a lover, lost a child, disowned by family, walked into the forest and never came out, slept one night and lost the way back. Tram flipped to the pages near the end. Dime, 23 years old, swallowed sleeping pills after her lover married someone else. Found by the stream in July, still bound by worldly attachments, refuses to rest. Right beneath Deem's page was a brand new sheet, the paper whiter, and at the very top, 2 words were already written in exceptionally faint ink. Phuong Tram. She nearly dropped the notebook. From downstairs, the old woman's voice suddenly rang out. Tram, dear. Her voice was still gentle, but drawn out longer than usual, as if she already knew. Tram frantically shoved everything back into the cabinet, but she accidentally left Deem's box slightly askew. She walked downstairs. The old woman stood by the stove, holding a basket of vegetables, staring at her for a very long time. Were you upstairs working, child? Yes. Did you hear the cat crying? Yes, I did. She smiled. That cat doesn't belong to any house. It only cries when someone is about to know things they shouldn't. A violent chill shot down Tram's spine. Dinner that evening passed with a terrifying smoothness. The old woman placed vegetables in her bowl, asked if she was tired, asked if her translation was almost done, asked if her mother back in the city was in good health. Every question was incredibly ordinary. Yet Tram felt every single word press down directly onto an open bruise. When night fell, she did not sleep. She hid Deem's poetry paper deep in her pocket. Outside, the frogs croaked in a frenzy, and then abruptly went dead silent. A crow cawed 3 times from the forest. The black cat wailed in the yard, the sound drawn out like a razor-thin thread slicing through the night. Then the poetry recitation began, but this time, amidst the chorus of voices, Tram heard Deem's voice clearest of all. It wasn't just sorrowful anymore. It was begging for help. Tram slipped out of the house in the dead of night, heading straight for the stream. The fog was so thick the flashlight could only illuminate a tiny white halo right at her feet. On either side of the path, the frogs started up again, but they were no longer rhythmic. They croaked in bursts, went dead silent, and then erupted again, as if invisible hands were strangling and releasing those wet little throats in the mud. The black cat walked a few steps ahead of her, its green eyes flaring in the mist, occasionally looking back to ensure she was following. When she reached the bank, Tram found Deem standing there. Thin white shirt, hair falling loose, her face drenched in tears. When she saw the piece of paper clenched in Tram's hand, Deem stopped avoiding her gaze. She only whispered, "You saw." Tram gasped for air. "You're dead, aren't you?" Deem closed her eyes. Tears rolled down her cheeks, but they carried absolutely no warmth. She nodded. Tram stumbled backward. Even though she had already guessed it, her body reacted as violently as if she had just been pushed off a cliff. "What are those boxes?" Deem didn't answer immediately. A gust of wind violently swept across the bank, flattening the reeds, making the black water ripple in concentric rings. From the opposite side of the stream, pale white silhouettes began to materialize among the trees, faceless, revealing only long hair and emaciated shoulders. Seeing them, Tram's throat locked completely tight. Deem grabbed her hand, dragging her back from the water's edge. "Don't look for too long. Who are they?" "The ones before you." The answer was shorter than any explanation, but infinitely heavier. Tram remembered the wooden boxes, the names, the scraps of letters, the hair, the rings, the handkerchief. Everything in that cabinet was no longer a disconnected clue. They were standing all around her in the form of mist-drenched white shadows. The old woman kept them, Tram asked. Deem shuddered violently. She remembers them. Then the remembering turns into keeping. The wind howled again. The sound of crows from the forest erupted, no longer three isolated caws, but a chaotic, frantic, raspy frenzy, as if an entire flock had just been startled awake off a corpse. The frogs went dead silent. The silence that followed made the flowing water sound exactly like people whispering to each other at the bottom of the stream. She used to hurt just like us, Deem spoke rapidly, her sentences breaking apart from sheer terror. No longer a coherent story, but fragments of truth ripped directly from her throat. She died in this forest a very long time ago. Abandoned, betrayed. She couldn't dissolve. Her pain drags others, just like her, into this place. Tram shook her head, staring at the white shadow. What about Tyne and Duck? Deem bit her lip. Some women came here while they were pregnant. Some lost their children before they died. Some only had the memory of a child they never got to hold. The village keeps those memories too. Tyne and Duck are no longer beings that the outside world can see. Tram thought of the taxi driver, the receptionist, the two empty seats, the emaciated horse that didn't need to eat. Then what is this village? Deem looked at her, her eyes brimming with pure despair. A shelter, a trap, both. The second the words left her mouth, the surface of the stream went black. It wasn't clouds obscuring the moon. It looked as if countless dark shadows were surfacing from beneath the water, swarming out toward the two of them. Tram heard impossibly light footsteps on the rotting leaves. The women in white shirts emerged from the forest, from the village paths, from the reeds, from the water's edge. They didn't charge, they didn't scream, they simply formed a circle. They cried without making a sound. Tears cascaded down their deathly pale faces. Some clutched their stomach, some held onto handkerchiefs, some gripped a bent ring, some cradled an empty space against their chests, as if holding an invisible child. Deem squeezed Tram's hand. You have to leave right now. Tram whispered, what about you? Deem looked down at her own hand, freezing cold within Tram's grasp. I already made my choice. Back then, I thought dying would end the pain. The old woman's voice cut through the air behind them. Deem. Just one single word, but it froze the entire stream. The white shadows bowed their heads. The black cat standing on a boulder suddenly arched its back, hissed violently, every hair standing on end, and bolted into the bushes. Crows flapped their wings deafeningly over the pine forest. The wind gusted so brutally that the reeds lashed painfully across Tram's face. The old woman stepped out of the mist, entirely stripped of the gentle, grandmotherly facade she wore by the stove. Her clothes were dark, silver hair half undone from her bun, her eyes sunken and bone-dry, her face radiating a terrifying mix of agony and supreme authority, like an ancient statue sculpted from pure resentment. Behind her, Tyne and Duck stood with their heads bowed, while the women in white parted to make way. She looked down at the piece of paper in Tram's hand. You took things out of their boxes. Deem trembled uncontrollably, dropping to her knees almost involuntarily. I'm sorry. Have you forgotten who gave you a place to cry? Her voice wasn't loud, but the surface of the stream shuddered. Tram felt her knees turn to water. Deem sobbed violently. I've cried enough. I want to live. The old woman stared at Deem for a long time. Her eyes weren't angry in the way human beings get angry. They were sad, exhausted, and terrifyingly deep. It's too late for that, child. The wind howled fiercer. The white shadows around the bank began to chant the poem incredibly softly, no longer forming a complete verse, but broken fragments of words scattering in the wind. Drifting soul, cannot forget, earthly love, being's human, better than a ghost. The sound spiraled around Tram, clawing into her ears, her neck, her chest. She found it hard to breathe. The old woman turned to her, her voice softening, and that gentleness was far more horrifying than her rage. You saw your name. Tram took a step back. The mud beneath her feet was slick. "I don't want to stay. Not right now, you don't. I want to live." The old woman nodded. "Then go lie." A crow shrieked wildly overhead. "Live until the world out there hurts you again. Live until your room feels as small as a coffin. Live until you realize no one actually wants you to hurt any less. And then you will hear the path calling you." Tram shook her head, tears pouring down her face. Those words weren't long, but every single sentence struck with the exact weight of those nights she sat on the floor of her room. The old woman didn't need a long explanation. She knew. She knew Tram's pain exactly like someone who had placed her own hands upon it. The black shadows beneath the stream suddenly surged higher, not forming distinct human shapes but writhing like living ink, crawling up the bank, slithering toward Tram's feet. Dame screamed, "Run!" Tram spun around, but the circle of white-clad women had closed in. They didn't touch her, but the sheer cold radiating off them crushed against her like a wall of water. Tyne looked up at Tram. There were tears in his eyes. He took a very tiny step to the side, creating a narrow gap between two of the white shadows. Duck did the exact same thing. That tiny movement felt like an agonizing apology. The old woman glared at them. The two boys bowed their heads, trembling, but they did not step back. Deem lunged forward, shoved the poetry paper into Tram's hand, then violently yanked it back, tearing it fiercely. The paper ripped in two. From the torn edge, a thin wisp of smoke drifted up, carrying the smell of ancient rain and sleeping pill. Deem shoved half the paper back into Tram's hand. "Only take half to remember. Don't let it guide you all the way back." The old woman stepped forward. The mud beneath her feet did not sink. "Deem!" This time the call was as sharp as a blade. Deem spun around, throwing both her arms around the old woman. That embrace was not an act of love. It was an act of restraint. "Run, sister." Tram bolted through the gap Tyne and Duck had opened. Behind her, the wind roared. The frogs simultaneously erupted into a deafening, psychotic chorus, as if thousands of wet throats in the mud were swelling at once to drown out the sound of her foot. Feral cats shrieked along the dirt path, their cries tearing through the mist. Crows swarmed overhead, their black wings slicing across the moon. Tram ran blindly, reeds whipping her face, mud splattering her legs, her breath tearing raggedly in her chest. Behind her, the old woman did not give chase with footsteps, but with her voice, sounding incredibly close, echoing directly inside Tram's skull. "You haven't escaped. No one escapes their own pain. I am merely waiting." The horse carriage was waiting at the village gate, as if it had anticipated this all along. The emaciated horse stood in the mist, eyes clouded, its breath producing no vapor despite the freezing cold. Tyne was already standing by the carriage, his face paler than usual, his eyes bloodshot red. Duck hauled her 2 suitcases out of nowhere and loaded them onto the carriage. No one asked how they had retrieved them. Tram practically collapsed into the back. Dame couldn't make it to the gates. She stood at the very boundary of the village path, her white shirt snapping in the wind, one hand gripping the other half of the paper, the other clutching her chest as if in agonizing pain. "Sister Tram," she called out. Tram looked back just that one final time. Behind Deem, the old woman stood in the middle of the path. The women in white had gathered behind her, every single face drenched in tears. She was no longer angry. She looked at Tram with the eyes of a predator who knew her prey hadn't fallen today, but the path back had already been marked. Deem yelled, her voice shredded by the wind. "Being human hurts so much, but being a ghost hurts even more." The hooves slammed into the dirt. The carriage tore into the forest. The village fell away behind them, drowning in the silver mist. The frogs roared on both sides of the path, as thick and heavy as blood boiling beneath the earth. A feral cat wailed from the last roof in the village, a long, mournful cry, before being entirely swallowed by the crows in the forest. Tram didn't dare turn her head back a second time. She was terrified that if she just looked back, she would see her attic window still lit, the charcoal stove still glowing red, the old woman leaving a bowl of hot rice on the table, and she would no longer have the strength to leave. When morning broke, Tram woke up at the edge of the forest, lying next to her two suitcases. The horse carriage was gone. Tyne and Duck were gone. Path leading into the village was now just a dense, overgrown trail choked with mist, looking as if no human had ever walked. In her hand, she tightly clutched the torn half of the paper, its edges charred, the remaining words broke. Buying human, better than a ghost. A local woodcutter passing by saw her and stopped in sheer panic. When she asked him about the village behind the forest, he stared at her for a long time before shaking his head. There's no village back there, miss. A long time ago, I heard some women ran away into those woods and vanished. People rumor that area is haunted. No one ever goes in. Tram didn't argue. She went back to the hotel. The receptionist went completely pale when she saw her, because according to her, Tram had checked out weeks ago, and no one had seen her return for her luggage. Taxi driver from before, when questioned, swore up and down that he had only driven her alone, and that she had spent the entire ride talking to two empty seats. Tram returned to the city, delivered her translation on time, collected her money, took care of her mother, provided for her sister, and kept on living. On the outside, she survived, but something inside her had been kept by that village. She no longer heard the rain the way she used. The rain made her remember the mist. The sound of frogs from any drainage ditch made the back of her neck go cold. The wail of feral cats in the alley at 3 in the morning made her hands tremble. Crows on the power lines outside her house made her remember the black silhouettes of pine trees against the forest sky. The torn half of Deem's paper lay in her drawer. Tram had intended to burn it many times, but she always stopped herself. Some days she would open the drawer and find the paper damp, as if it had just been sitting by the edge of the stream. Some days she wouldn't open it at all, yet she would still hear the faintest sound of poetry echoing from within, like someone singing from deep beneath the earth. Years later, Tram still hasn't gone back. She still lives, still works, still cares for her mother, still smiles when she has to, still tells acquaintances that she is doing fine. But she knows the old woman's words were true in the most brutal way possible. Pain has a memory. It knows the way. It knows how to call you. There are nights she jolts awake in the middle of the city because she hears the deafening roar of frogs, even though outside her window there is nothing but concrete, streetlights, and distant cars. There are nights a stray cat wails endlessly in the apartment courtyard, and in the wind whistling through the cracks of her door, she hears a distant, haunting voice reciting, "I wander through the realm of mist." Oh no. In those moments, she flips on every light in the house, walks over to look at her mother sleeping in the next room, ease at her sister's graduation photo on the desk, looking desperately at the markers of real life to remind herself that she is still here, still alive, and hasn't chosen to stay. But deep in a pitch-black corner of her heart, where no one else can ever reach, there remains a mist-covered dirt path leading back to a village that doesn't exist on any map. Over there, the women in white still hold hands beneath the moon, reciting the poem of a dead romance. The old woman still sits by the freezing charcoal stove, keeping the high attic room empty for a guest who refuses to return. Tyne and Duck still stand beside the skeletal horse, waiting at the edge of the forest whenever an exhausted, wandering soul loses its way. And Deem still stands by the edge of the stream, clutching the other half of the paper, her eyes sorrowful, her hands freezing cold, whispering to anyone who can hear the call of pure despair. Don't come here to stay. Being human hurts so much, but being a ghost hurts even more.